Hey homie, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Ebby Mercury, and if you're an oldie but a goodie, welcome back. We are still in our series of videos about the ninth house, and if you watch the first ninth house video, you'll already know that it's about religion, philosophy, tarot, astrology, foreign travel. We've got a special guest here with us today. This is someone who has transformed the way that I practice astrology and tarot. He is my teacher and mentor, an internationally recognized and award-winning astrologer and 5-star author on Amazon, Mychal A. Bryan. Stay tuned for our conversation to hear his story and glean some insights about ninth house topics. We'll be right back after the beat drops. Fans of the channel will know that we recently shared a video on the ninth house in astrology, detailing many of its significations. We're fortunate to have a couple of guests who focus on ninth house topics joining us over the next couple of episodes. Today on the show, we've got two astrological legends in the making, me and Mychal A. Bryan.
Hey there, Ebony. How are you?
Yes, I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty great.
Good. Okay. So I just wanted to, before we dive into questions and the bio and all of that, I wanted to let people know how I got to know you. I will say I was at a low point in my astrological career. I had already started my practice and it had been going well, but I had this one reading and it just went fine. It was just okay. But you know me well enough. Mychal, you know me well enough to know that I'm a Saturnian person, so just okay was like soul crushing for me. So I was like, okay, I can either hang up my cleats and not be in this game anymore, or I can improve my foundation and get something that's firm and solid to build from. And it just so happened that I think that same week I attended some online conference and you were speaking. And it was like the heavens opened up. When the student is ready, the teacher appears. And there you were, Mychal A. Bryan, talking about traditional Renaissance astrology, so confident and I just loved your energy and your swagger and your confidence. And I was like, that's my teacher right there. Yeah, and we've been together pretty much since then. I think I joined a few months later in FOCA at Oraculos, and that's been that. And it's almost 4 years later this year.
Wow. That's crazy. It's been, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know the beginning of that, but I know that we met at, I can't remember which online conference it was. And I distinctly remember you wearing an orange sweater and you were laying down on the couch.
Pandemic time.
That's my memory. That's my memory of you in the conference. And I was like, who is this person in their orange sweater just reclining? Anyway, and so I'm so happy that you reached out. And yeah, 4 years ago, wow, I think so much has changed at Oraculos in that time. And it feels like I thought it was like 6 years ago or something, but it feels so long. But I guess it was at the beginning of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I'll dive into your bio just quickly to kind of mention some of the highlights there so people will get to know some of the amazing things that you do and what your background is like. So Mychal is a Bahamian Jamaican astrologer, journalist, author, clinical hypnotherapist, specializing in hypnotic dream work. He practices Renaissance and Uranian astrology in his client work, focusing largely on predictive and medical astrology research. And he founded the Oraculo School of Astrology, where I'm a student, sometimes here and there. Sometimes still a student.
You're a graduate.
Yeah, I'm a graduate, but then I circle back. I'm like a super senior. But Mychal's also a certified yoga teacher for Iyengar Yoga and Jikiden Reiki instructor. So he's been doing a lot of things. And as you know, this is the ninth house that we're talking about right now. So I am curious about your journey through the ninth house. Like, what was your first introduction to ninth house themes in your life? And like, what has that transition been like for you over time?
That's a great question, Ebony. And I think for me, my introduction to the ninth house came from me being a young child in the Bahamas, and it also corresponded with me figuring out who I was sexually. And I was a young gay black child in the Bible Belt of the Bahamas, and it was very strange or odd for me to really feel as if I fit into my society. I think my family tolerated me to a large extent, and I was loved by my family, but I think that going outside of my family sphere, it was really difficult for me to feel like I really fit in. So, and that is and isn't true. I think that I've always kind of made a seat for myself at any table that I've ever found myself confronted with. So, on the one hand, I felt as if I didn't fit in. On another hand, I felt as if I made my own paths, even as a preteen, basically. And around that same time, I think J.K. Rowling was coming out with her books, the Harry Potter series, and there was Charmed on TV, and then there was the X-Men, and there was this other thing called Mutant X. And so there were all of these things within media that said, hey, you know, if you're weird, there's a space for you or there's a place for you. And it's in this world of magic and mystery and esotericism, like this is where you belong. And so I don't really know if I went into those spaces to find a sense of belonging or if I went into those spaces because I just felt within myself as if that's what I should be doing. You know, it's kind of fuzzy for me. I think that if I was a straight child and didn't have all of this other angst, then maybe I would have thought twice about entering astrology and magic and all of that stuff. But I think that based on where I was in my life, it just seemed like it was natural for me to gravitate towards something else for weirdos, basically. And so I was reading Harry Potter and Anne Rice and all of this stuff, and I really wanted to participate in these worlds that these authors created in their books. And I, cutting a long story short, I eventually found an online community called the Wingmakers, W-I-N-G, the Wingmakers. I think they were based in New Zealand, and a lot of their work had to do with the development of latent psychic abilities. And so I spent a big chunk of my early teens trying to go through the Wingmaker curriculum and trying to figure out if I could develop these abilities, like bending spoons with my brain and making fire do whatever, and so all of these stuff. And so it was a very fantastical demonstration of magic, in the same way as what we see on TV is a very fantastic demonstration of magic. Mm-hmm. And after a while, realizing that that probably wasn't possible, I started to search out other more boring paths. So that's what led me to the tarot, because the tarot was, the tarot was comparatively more boring than shooting fire out of my hands. And I think the inspiration for that actually came from Charmed, the television show Charmed, because on Charmed, have you ever watched Charmed?
A couple times, yeah.
So on Charmed, there were these three sisters, Piper, Prue, and Phoebe, and then they kicked Prue out because no one liked Shannon Doherty anymore, and then they brought in the other one, I can't remember her name, Rose McGowan. Anyway, so Prue was telekinetic. She could move things with her brain, and then Piper could freeze time, and then Phoebe was the runt of the litter. All she could do was tell the future. And so, exactly. And so for me, trying to build my life based on the one representation I saw in the media, I was like, okay, I'm not a Prue. I'm not going to move things with my brain. I'm not a Piper. I'm not going to freeze time. At least let me do the low-hanging fruit, which is tell the future. And that is what eventually led me to the tarot. And I think from tarot, it was just one rabbit hole into everything else that I do. And I'm so grateful that that occurred to me. And even though it's like stupid to say it out loud, I'm so grateful that I had that impetus to say, hey, if these other fantastic things aren't possible, at the least you can do, the very least as far as fruits of the spirit would be to tell the future. And I'm so happy I made that decision, because it just opened up a world of profundity that was never available to me before. And I'm still building my life, and I'm still studying those practices based on things that I was doing from I was 12 years old, basically.
Mm. I love that the bottom of the barrel for you is the top of the chart for everyone else.
Always.
Yes, I love that. That's so Mychal. Wow. And then you just kind of transition from there into all of these different spaces. I feel like you're such a great example of the ninth house, because not only are you, at least right now, living in a country that's not the one you were born in, speak several languages, got the yoke, the tarot, the astrology, all of that. And I know you have a background in church as well, or at least like your family's pretty religious as well. So it's all of the pieces coming together. But speaking of just kind of astrology, well, not just astrology, but all of your practices really. At Homegirl Astrology, one of our core values is legacy. So we acknowledge our shared history and heritage and sow the seeds for future generations healed and whole. So I know you have mentioned many, many times before that you've been guided or mentored by prominent figures in the various disciplines that you practice. So I assume legacy is important to you as well. I'd love to hear more about how your mentors have shaped your approach to the practice of astrology in particular. But if you want to answer for the other ones, I'd love to hear that too.
That's a great question. I confronted with this question often within my giving interviews, and in writing my latest book on horary astrology and the natal promise, which is going to be coming out at the beginning of May, a friend of mine, Anthony Lewis, who is a world-renowned horary astrologer, wrote the foreword for the book. And within it, when he was writing it, he was like, hey, remind me who you've been mentored by, who you've been taught by, so that I could include that, basically. And I find that oftentimes happens because people need to make sense of why I know so much. And I feel like that's often the case, that there's this sense that I have to have come from something, which, to be fair, I have trained with several people within my astrological life. I think the beginning of my journey into the NCGR, which is the National Council for Geocosmic Research, and they have an exam, the Professional Astrologers Alliance exam, it's a nice exam. It's an exam for astrologers. So I've been taken through that curriculum by Mychal Epstein, who is in charge of giving that education. I've also been trained in horary astrology by Lee Lehman, who is one of the prominent horary astrologers in the world today. She wrote the book, The Martial Arts of Horary Astrology, and I've gone through her entire horary curriculum one-on-one with her. And Christine Skinner is somebody who I love, not because I've been trained by Christine, but because I love the practicality and the concreteness of her astrology. And Nicholas Smuts-Alsop is somebody who I also love, not because my astrology looks anything like her astrology, but because she is also a practical, concrete astrologer. And Gary Kristen is somebody who I've trained with extensively in Uranian astrology. And Faith McInerney is somebody who I love. And as I go through this list of people, I realize that while there are some technical things that I've ironed out, so for example, with Gary, I've ironed out everything that's technical with Uranian astrology because it's a technical system. It needs a lot of ironing out. With Lee, I've ironed out the shape of traditional horary astrology and really how to navigate that for myself. And at the same time, I also acknowledge that nothing about how I practice horary astrology or even astrology in general looks like Lee Lehman. And nothing about how I practice natal astrology looks like Mychal Epstein or Faith McInerney or Gary Kristen or anyone, because what is most important for me always is seeing the example of how somebody does something and then asking myself, can you do that at that same level? And if you can't do it at that same level, what about what you're doing prevents that from being possible for you? So even though I've been trained, if we're going to use that language, even though I've been trained by many people, and there are people who I love and who I'd send clients to get readings, I think that my style of astrology is completely mine, and it doesn't look like anywhere I've been before, because my whole goal with founding Oraculos and with just being an astrologer in general is to take an example. And the example that's most important for me is the example of seeing concrete, event-based astrology in action. So the people who I've studied with, my version of studying with someone isn't really learning a technique from someone, it's really just watching how somebody gives a reading. So there's a lot of other people on the list as well who I've attempted to study with, i.e., I've attempted to give those people a chart on the spot and see how they do. And those people have failed drastically and have not been able to read the chart on the spot. And as you know, for me, that is the hallmark of a good astrologer. If you are a good astrologer, a seasoned astrologer, I should be able to give you a chart on the spot and you should be able to read that without hesitation. And the only people who have actively done that to my satisfaction at a level that I currently do that, or even beyond, are the people who I've listed in the forms of Lee Lehman has demonstrated that skill to me, Gary Kristen, Faith McInerney, Nicholas Smuts Alsop, Judith Hill also has demonstrated that skill for me. A lot of people who I haven't trained with per se, but I've sat back and I've watched how they read the chart. And then after the call is done, I sit with myself and I say, hey, Mychal, there were certain things about that was amazing. There were certain things about that wasn't necessarily amazing. There were certain things about that just blew your socks off. How can you replicate that within your own practice without necessarily replicating that person's voice or their style or their technique? So I know that this is a very convoluted answer, and it's something I've been sitting with, especially, like I said, since Tony writing the foreword for my book. And I really had to sit back and say, hey, whose astrology or whose astrological hand can be seen within what you do? And I realized that there really isn't anyone who you could look at and say, oh, wow, he got that from this person, or he got that from that person, or he got that from that person. But behind me, I think I have the experience of seeing how other master astrologers do what I do. And I have their example to let me know that practicing astrology in this way is valid.
So carry on with that. How would you say that you incorporate your identity into the way that you practice and also the way that you teach as well?
That's a great question. And I think that for me feels more within me as opposed to who I've trained with per se. And once again, if you had asked me this question like 2 months ago, I'd be like, oh yeah, sure, I trained with ba 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 ba, and I would have listed the names of people. But I think that question, how is it me, is a very big thing. And first and foremost, I from the Caribbean, and I think that there are certain characteristics in terms of being from the Caribbean and certain ways how education is conducted in the Caribbean that just don't exist anywhere else. I remember when I was in university, one of the things that our lecturers would constantly say to us, and even in high school actually, and even in primary school, one of the things that our teachers and lecturers would say to us is that, hey, you all are in university, in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, you have access to us as your lecturers. Please take advantage of that, because when you go to America and you're in a class with 300 students, your lecturer doesn't even know who you are. So take advantage of this opportunity and of this proximity so that you actually learn in a way that's deep and profound, and you get everything that you need to get from us, because we're here to give you everything that is within us to give. Because if you were to transplant yourself into America, you'd realize that the American school system isn't built for this level of proximity and this depth of education in the way that we're trying to give it to you. And that always stood out for me. And I think when I look at how astrology is taught in America today and just in the West in general, it carries that same thing of there really isn't a lot of proximity with the students. There is no quality control. There is no knowing or testing what the students know and the testing them on the spot to see. So all of that. So I think that that comes from my Caribbean upbringing, and my Caribbean education in general through primary school, high school, university. Then after I was done with university, I went to Cuba to study dance because I also put myself through dance school while I was pursuing my degree in journalism. And in Cuba, I think that was a very big moment for me in terms of just seeing what excellence looks like. And the Cuba stories is a huge story, but when I was in Cuba, I saw children in the streets at 7 years old who had a level of ballet proficiency that people in their 30s didn't have in Jamaica or in the Bahamas or in other places where I trained before. And they were just wearing their flip-flops in the street, and they were doing 8 pirouettes on the spot in like a t-shirt and jeans and whatever. And so it was just a completely different level of asking myself, hey, do you hold what you practice in the way how these 7-year-olds hold it, in the way how it just oozes out of them so effortlessly? And then I had a dance teacher in Cuba, Maria Cristina Aldana. And at the beginning of every class, it felt so like psychological, like she was training our minds, because at the beginning of every class, we spent 5 minutes just standing on the spot and just breathing while she just screamed at us. And she would just be screaming at us and shouting into us and saying, remember who you are. Remember what you represent. Remember that when you go into the world, you represent La Escuela Nacional de Danza. You represent this national school of dance in Cuba. Remember when you go into the world, you are a Cuban dancer. Look at the Bahamian. Even he is becoming a Cuban dancer. Remember that you're learning this modern dance technique of Cuba. Remember that this technique doesn't exist anywhere else in the world other than Cuba. Remember the spirit of the technique that you're learning. 5 minutes. And at the end of that 5 minutes, we'd all be pelting buckets of sweat, because that level of psychological training, it was so profound and it was so deep, and it changed and it transformed everything about how we did that class. And that's something that I also bring into Oraculos. Once again, these don't represent astrological people who I've learned from or astrological spaces that I've learned in, but they represent the larger story of how I've just been trained as a human being and how I bring that into Oraculos. And then I think the final thing is my Iyengar yoga training, which, Iyengar yoga, as far as systems of yoga are concerned, it takes 6 years to be an Iyengar yoga teacher, whereas in other systems of yoga, it takes 21 days. And so the format of how Iyengar yoga is taught, the hierarchy of Iyengar yoga, back in the day, probably 3 years ago, we had a system where you graduated from your intro 1 and 2 certificate, which took 6 years to get. And then after that, you waited 2 years, and then you went on to intermediate junior 1, intermediate junior 2, intermediate junior 3. Then intermediate senior 1, intermediate senior 2, intermediate senior 3, then advanced junior 1, advanced junior 2. And so I built the curriculum at Oraculos in that same way. So we have FOCA, and then after that you have PCA 1, PCA 2, PCA 3, and some people joke and say, there's a PCA 50 as well. But I built it in that same 16 level system of Iyengar yoga. And we don't have 16 levels at Oraculos, but maybe we do if I lay them all out. But the point is that it's something about that systematic teaching or that systematic giving of an education that I brought from Iyengar yoga, and I bring that into the Oraculos space. So those 3 things, my Caribbean education, my Cuban dance training, and my Iyengar yoga background, that is what I think I specifically bring to Oraculos. And those things are the things that I think really constitute the Oraculos difference in terms of what we offer as an astrology school.
Mm, yeah. And hearing you lay that out, that definitely resonates with my experience at Oraculos. People often ask me, about my experience because they're interested in taking classes with you. And I always say, it's intense, it's rigorous. You will be pop quizzed. But I think that kept me on my toes, and that's what I needed definitely at that point in time. And the proximity piece is very key. Having taken other classes since leaving, that is something that I have missed out on. And, just to spill a little tea, but not one of the classes I was recently in, people actually asked for refunds at the end of it because
Wow.
it was just that organization and like consistency and rigor was not there. And you just don't get the same experience everywhere that you go. You really have to be mindful, I think, within the astrological space, at least, maybe others too, of who you're learning from and who you're reaching out to for access in that way.
Yeah.
And I will say this is sort of a weird thing, but a lot of my favorite teachers have been from the Caribbean. So my religion teacher in college that I took multiple classes with was from Antigua, I think. And one of my favorite yoga teachers I work with, she's Cuban. So it's definitely a thing.
Yeah, I don't know. And I think when I was growing up, there was probably some level of shame in being from the third world, because the Caribbean is still the 27 Caribbean states or countries were still considered to be a third world region of the world. And so I think that there was something about that that was very stressful for me, and I always wanted to find ancestral ties to someplace else that wasn't the Caribbean per se. But as I've grown older and as I look back at just my high school teachers and some of the psychological training that they've instilled into us, and as I just look at everything, I'm so grateful. Like I'm so grateful for Mr. McBean. I'm so grateful for Mr. James. I'm so grateful for Miss Jacks. I'm so grateful for Miss Jackman. I'm so grateful for all of these people who represent different Caribbean countries, because there's a fundamental thing of caring about the product that exists within the Caribbean. And I think the underlying message in that is, hey, people don't expect you to know anything. And I remember distinctly a teacher of mine, I can't remember who it was, who said this to us. She said, people don't expect you to know anything. People expect that when you go into the world and you tell them that you're from the Caribbean or that you're West Indian or you're from the West Indies, people expect for you to live in a coconut tree. They expect for you to, be accountable, basically. They don't expect for you to be evolved, and they don't expect for you to come from anything. So prove them wrong. And that line of prove them wrong existed within every step of my education, from preschool all the way to Cuba. And I don't know, I'm so grateful that I was trained in that, because I can't imagine being trained in anything else. But there has always been this thread of prove them wrong within every educational space that I was either in willingly or that I was forced in. This sense of people don't expect anything from us as a Caribbean people. Prove them wrong, be the best, be the shining star in any arena you enter. And I brought that into Oraculos as well. And I think that in the beginning, because you definitely were there in the beginning of my transition online, I think that your class during the pandemic, no, I think you were part of the second batch, because I had a previous batch and there's videos of me and them on YouTube doing like a horror chart, whatever. But
Cameron,
I think tell me.
Cameron and Tracy and all those people.
No, even before them. So I don't know. Geez. But there's from before. But yeah, I think at the point at which you came on and your group came on, I was still very at the beginning of knowing how to teach online, because I had only been teaching in person up until that point. And so it was a strange thing for me. And I think I brought all of the fire of the Bahamas and Jamaica and Cuba. And I don't think that I was ready to teach American audiences, because for a lot of people it was very it was just very intense. And as I look back at myself, I was teaching even a yoga class last night, and I was just like, wow, Mychal, you're such a softer person. Like, you turn 30 and you just turn the new page. Because back in my 20s, when I was teaching astrology and teaching yoga and like, I was just a complete tyrant, is the word that's been used by a lot of people on a number of occasions. But I think that I was very gung-ho that, hey, be the best, be the best, be the best. And some people, like, we just want to learn some astrology. We don't want to be, we just want to like read a chart, dude, get over yourself. And I think that now I've gotten over myself, but I feel like now I've still been able to instill something in my students that makes them want to do that without me having to scream it every week. I'm a different person.
Yeah, you definitely softened up. I hop into class every now and then, like, who is this guy? Meanwhile, you were cracking the whip back in 2020.
It
With,
was.
several, like, well, a couple of us were working at the same time. So in the middle of work calls, but also on oracular school calls during the day. It was it was such a time. And
The students now don't even have a clue.
right. I occasionally have compared you to the band instructor in Whiplash, but that has definitely changed. And you were always very kind to me and very supportive of me, but there were some moments. There were some moments. But I do feel like I'm a much stronger astrologer because of the experiences that I've had at Oraculos. And you request, I don't think you actually request a lot of students, because there's not like ongoing homework assignments every day that you're having to turn in some way. But it does encourage people to actually do the work, to actually study, to actually focus and try. And in other cases, you kind of have to have, everything has to be internal motivation in other schools versus their external piece that's there with OSA too. At the end of the day, if people don't learn, that's on them, right?
Yeah.
Because you're going to do what you can do, and maybe you're not the right person for them, or that could be the thing too.
Yeah.
But sometimes you just need that little bit of external motivation too, and I appreciated that.
There have been so many astrologers who I've studied with on the list that I gave who say things that are emphatically incorrect as far as traditional astrology is concerned. That it just isn't true. And it's like air, for example. I remember I was talking to one of my astrology people who I love, and I said, this person published a book, and in the book it says that air is cold and dry. And I said to her, I said, hey, I know that that's what air might feel like. But air is actually, from a traditional Aristotelian perspective, air is actually hot and wet. Those are the qualities associated with air. And she got so offended by that. And after that, I just shut up, because I realized that if that's what you believe, that's what you believe. I know it's incorrect. But if I'm paying this money, this $250 for an hour of your time to study with you, let me shut the hell up and just leave you with whatever you're saying, because I don't need for you to change what you're saying, because the majority of what you do is spectacular to me. I don't need to change this one misunderstanding of yours. There's another astrologer as well who swears up and down the mountains that she's a traditional astrologer. And one of her colleagues, another prominent medical astrologer, very, very prominent, said to me once, Mychal, why don't you tell her? He was like, when is somebody going to tell her that she's not practicing traditional astrology? I said, not I, said the cat. You go tell her, you know, let everybody else tell her that she's not practicing traditional astrology. But it isn't for me to tell this woman who is spectacular at what she does, who believes with every fiber of her being that she's a Renaissance astrologer. It's not up to me to turn around and say, hey, actually, this isn't what Renaissance astrology is like, because the majority of what she does is spectacular. That misunderstanding, let her die with it. I'm not going to be the one to change her mind, because whenever I step into space with her, I do so with the intention of learning or whatever. So anyway, saying all that to say that I think that there's a difference in terms of how people learn.
Speaking of teaching in general, and thinking about your path and how you've learned over time, at what point did you feel like, okay, now I'm good to teach, now I can carry this message forward into the world to share with others?
You know, I've been cursed with a particular brand of arrogance that leads me to believe very early on that let me step back from that for a second. I come from a family of teachers. My aunt was a teacher. She hated my guts, but she was a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher. My mother built curriculums for teachers. That was my mother's job growing up. She was a secretary by day, and in the evening she would literally, she was the one who wrote the curriculums for teachers. I didn't even know that was a job. And now that I think back on it, I don't even think that really is a job. It was just that teachers were too busy teaching a class of 50 students to write their own curriculums. So they would hand my mother their notes and she would organize it into the shape of a curriculum. When my mother went to university, when I was probably in the 7th grade or something, I was doing research alongside my mother. I remember she had a paper to write on voodoo and magic within the Caribbean, which is crazy that was the paper she was writing. But she had this paper to write on voodoo and magic in the Caribbean, and I was her research assistant. And so I learned about MLA format as a child, helping my mother with her university English 119 writing project on voodoo in the Caribbean. So I've always been surrounded by syllabi. I've always been surrounded by curriculums in the process of being built. I've always been surrounded by teachers. I've never not been surrounded by teachers. I come from a teaching history. I come from a teaching background. And more than that, I come from a mother who always knew how to organize information, because that's what she did. My mother was a secretary. She had me when she was 18. The first job she had was as a secretary in a hotel. Then after that job was done, she went with her boss and she became his private secretary. And then she went on her own and she started organizing and building curriculums for teachers. And so I've always been in a space where information had to make sense. Information had to be packaged well. Information had to be organized in a systematic way. And then that got reinforced in Cuba and it got reinforced in Iyengar Yoga. So that's always been my life. And so I was saying earlier that I've been cursed with a particular brand of arrogance, but I don't even think that's true. When I look back at my entire life, I just know how to organize information well. And I think I do a marvelous job at that. And I think that as a result of knowing how to organize information, I know how to teach anything that I put my hands on and that I sincerely want to share with others. And so to the question, when did I realize that I was good enough to be teaching? I feel like I've always tried to teach what I know. Even from I was 15 years old, I remember trying to teach people how to open their third eye, basically, because I just felt like, hey, I've been studying this for a while and I want to share it with you. Also, I think that there's something powerful in the process of teaching, whereas even if you don't know something fully, if you force yourself to be in a position to share that with others, you go the extra mile to make sure that that person knows what they need to know about that subject.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like in the very beginning of my teaching career back in the Bahamas, before the whole Zoom and, finding out about astrology in America, I surrounded myself with a body of students who wanted to learn astrology. They wanted to learn tarot. They wanted to learn these things that I had been studying for a while. And I forced myself to open my mouth and teach them what was within me. And at the end of the lecture, I was like, wow, Mychal, there were really things that you didn't know. You need to go and brush upon them. And when I came back that much more prepared. And so, in answering your question, if we were to do it temporally, like when within the timeline, if I started when I was 12 years old, I tried to teach my first person around the age of 15 years old. So that's 3 years of me giving readings and making mistakes and trying to package what I knew. And then I went to university at 16 years old. And when I was in university, I didn't really do any teaching during university, but I had a thriving and a robust client practice. And by the end of university, I moved to Cuba, so there was no teaching going on within my life then. But when I was done with Cuba and got back to Nassau when I was around probably 23, 25 years, 20, probably 24 years old, I knew that I had everything I needed in order to start teaching professionally tarot, astrology, runes, all of these things that I had studied for years.
So it sounds like there was a need and people were out there asking for the support and you felt like you were equipped to share that with them. And I
Yeah,
really, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, 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 I was just gonna say, and I don't say that from a naive place. I think that along with being supremely confident in my ability to teach in general, because I genuinely think that that's what I've done in every lifetime. I've been a teacher forever, basically. So beyond me thinking that I'm supremely well equipped to teach in general, I also have a certain level of self-clarity that allows me to know when I sound stupid. And in the Caribbean, we have this concept, it's called the shame tree. And in the Caribbean, we pride ourselves on not having a very tall shame tree, which means that we never put ourselves in a position to be embarrassed. We're very proud people from the Caribbean. We never put ourselves in a position to be embarrassed. So when we step forward, when Usain Bolt steps forward and says, I'm the fastest man in the world, he means it. He's not going to say that just to, then come fourth place or then come second place. He means it. And that's the same thing with me, I think. I always know when I don't know enough. And I never let myself stand in a position to appear as if I know something if I genuinely know that I don't know enough to be there. So I think that understanding of when you're ready to do something also has to be based on a very sincere and honest and painful level of self-reflection, which a lot of people don't have. Because a lot of people feel as if they know far more than they actually know, and then they stand up and they sound stupid because they're not aware of what they don't know. I think I said this in a class once that there are 4 levels of competency. There's unconsciously incompetent, you're awful at something and you don't know how bad you are. Then you realize, and then you become consciously incompetent, and after you become consciously incompetent, you start to work like crazy to develop actual competence. And then after that, you become consciously competent. You're competent, but it's because you're still working like crazy to be competent. And then after that, you become unconsciously competent. You can do it in your sleep. And I think a lot of people put themselves in positions to teach astrology, to demonstrate astrology, to practice astrology, to defend astrology, and they're still at the bottom of the barrel. They're still at the level of being unconsciously incompetent. You have only performed for people in your church, and everybody in your church has given you a standing ovation. And because the people in your church have given you a standing ovation, you think you're ready to perform on Broadway. You're not ready to perform on Broadway if the people in your church give you a standing ovation, because they're supposed to clap for you. That's what they do. They're church people. They're supposed to make you feel good about yourself, your family, your friends, telling you you're amazing. They're supposed to tell you you're amazing, or else you need a different set of family and friends. However, a lot of people they take that and they use that as the authority to build a practice on, and they haven't actually tested themselves in any other arena than the arena of the people close to them, and they sound ridiculous. And so for me, I've always put myself in front of crowds of people who I don't know. I've always forced myself to be good in the front of strangers, because I feel as if I can get a standing ovation from a group of strangers, then I genuinely know that I have it within me to share this with anyone. And I think that that's what more people need to do. They need to really honestly put themselves on a practicum, basically, where they work with people who they don't know and get the feedback from those people who they don't know, so that they can actually see what the value of their craft is, whether that's teaching or whether that's practicing astrology or whether that's whatever. Go to people who have no emotional attachment to you, and you get their feedback and see what they say about how your practice is, and let that be the source of your learning, but also the source of you figuring out whether or not you're ready to actually do what it is you want to do, whether that's teaching, practicing, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as I shared at the beginning, I was basically unconsciously incompetent into the halls of Miraculous. And I think, even in 12-step programs, they talk about hitting rock bottom before you go and get help. And that's kind of what that experience was like for me. So I think some people may not have hit their bottom yet, and they're kind of riding high within that space of not being competent, but eventually it'll hit. I'm glad it happened early on in my career versus later on, after I've been more prominent. But it's fun. You mentioned organizing information and how that's a hallmark of what you do when you're teaching. Regardless of what people say about you, they always say that you're a good teacher, that you know the information, you teach it well, they know the information well because of having learned from you. And when you mentioned organizing information, I think about Saturn Poseidon from Indian astrology, and the organization that comes with Saturn, and the truth and the light that comes from Poseidon, and tying that together. And that's very much what you're doing, is organizing that truth and light and bringing it to the masses. So on the note of Uranian, and maybe you want to go Uranian, maybe you want to go a different route, but I'm curious about areas of astrological research that hold the most promise, do you think, for advancing the field?
Astrology is a very fuzzy subject, and it's made fuzzy by things like houses, for example. And I say that, I say that with a grain of salt, because I don't honestly believe that, because I have done very high stake, high risk astrology, and I've based a lot of my own delineations on houses. And this thing is in this house, therefore, or the rule of your this house is in your this house, therefore. And so I feel like I have a thorough understanding and appreciation for that style of traditional astrology. And at the same time, I am in deep awe of systems of astrology that don't really subscribe to any of our traditional astrological thoughts, such as Uranian astrology, for example. And the premise of Uranian astrology is something that is still quite undeveloped, because the premise of Uranian is that the planets themselves are the architects of our concrete experiences that we have within our lifetimes. And why is that significant? That's significant because it's saying, hey, if we were to strip the sky of everything, and if we were to strip the sky of all of its stories and of all of its myths and of all of its houses, these things that technically don't exist, what we would end up with is a sea of stars and a group of planets sailing across that sea of stars forever. And so Uranian astrology for me is powerful for that reason. Uranian astrology and the knockoff of Uranian astrology, which is cosmobiology, they're both powerful for me, or they're both powerful to me for that reason, because they focus on the combinations of these planetary factors as being descriptive of everything that occurs within our lives. There are limitations to that. And there are positives to that. I think one of the limitations is that Uranian astrology and cosmobiology don't have the same natural internal organizing mechanism as traditional astrology has, because in traditional astrology, you talk about the first house until you're done, and then you talk about the second house until you're done, and then you talk about the third house until you're done. And so Uranian astrology and cosmobiology tends to just be a litany of information, of random facts. They're very random systems of astrology. They give us a lot of information, but that information isn't organized in the same way that traditional astrology has this natural organizing component of talking about the personality, then talking about the money, then talking about the siblings, then. So what I'm trying to do at this moment is build Uranian astrology in the likeness of the organization of traditional astrology, which hasn't really been done before, ever. I don't know one person who practices Uranian astrology in this way, where I'm looking to see, okay, how can I organize this in such a way whereas I talk about the personality first, then I talk about the money second, then I talk about the siblings, and how can I get that same organization of traditional astrology and superimpose this onto the chaos that is Uranian astrology so that I can still have the same traditional sense of sequencing within this very modern system. And so that's kind of where I am at the moment in terms of my personal efforts. And it's difficult because there is no template for that. There's nobody who's left that behind. There's nobody who's even thought as if that was necessary. Uranian astrology and cosmobiology tend to be used as research tools. So you know something about a person, and you go into that person's chart to see if you find that planetary combination. So, for example, you know somebody had an awful marriage. So you go in their chart and you look at their sun moon midpoint to see what's going on. Or you know this person was infertile. So you go in their charts and you look at their Venus Zeus midpoint to see what's going on. So it's very much a call and response system of astrology, Uranian astrology, whereas you know a detail, you go in the chart to see if the things you think should be there are actually there. And more often than not, they are there because that's what astrology is, a reflection of our actual lives. However, it is not built, Uranian and cosmobiology are not built with the same sort of structured layering of information as traditional astrology is. And I haven't met any Uranian astrologer who knows how to do that. The one person who I think does that relatively well is Faith McInerney. But the reason for that is because she's still using the 12 houses chart on the side of the midpoint listing, or she's still using the 12 houses chart, which we're familiar with in Uranian astrology, alongside the Uranian astrology dial, which is, for those of you who don't know, the dial is what we use in Uranian astrology. It doesn't really have houses. So with Faith, you see this layering of the first house and the second house and blah, 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 and going through the story of the houses that other Uranian astrologers lack. But it's because she is using a 12 houses chart alongside a no houses Uranian astrology structure. What I want to do is I want to only practice on the no houses Uranian structure without having to reference the 12 houses chart. And so I'm really on the cutting edge of something that is feeling very exciting, but there is still no template for how to do it. And so I'm still kind of overwhelmed by the prospect of it. But I think that the demands of the students who I'm working with at the moment their demands necessitate that I figure it out and that I figure it out quickly. And I think that we've made some very good headways towards that end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Uranian astrology is so promising. And I think it definitely, especially when adding in the trans-Neptunian planets, you're able to see things that may have been there on the traditional wheel, but may not have been as obvious as they are when adding in the TMPs. It's been really enlightening for me. So I've really enjoyed adding that skill set to my practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thinking about another ninth house topic, you mentioned you have a book coming out. You've already released one book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, in 2023. And now your new book is being published soon, or you're working on it. It's moving
Mhm.
towards being published. And we know the ninth house is also a house of publishing. So I'd love to hear about your process of getting a book out into the world. Like, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced? What are some of the things that you've appreciated or enjoyed about it?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things for me to navigate initially was figuring out whether or not I wanted to publish with somebody else or whether or not I wanted to self-publish. And this is a huge topic, I think, in the astrology world, because I actually don't know if it's a huge topic in the astrology world. It was a huge topic for me because I I never, once again, I come from the Caribbean. I have a tall shame tree, and I really don't want it to ever. I just don't want to look bad. And I was very fearful about self-publishing because I thought that I would look bad. And I sat down with a prominent astrology publisher who kind of guaranteed me that if I tried to publish my own work, I would look bad. And that was very stressful for me. It was exceptionally stressful because I never want for anybody to look at anything I do and think that it is less than my Caucasian counterpart or think that it is less than somebody else's. And to a large degree, there's a lot that I do at Oraculos that I would love to do in a better way. For a long time, we had a website that wasn't really where I wanted it to be, and then we switched the website out completely, and it's still not where I really want it to be because we have a small team. So I'm looking to make more updates to that. And then even with the Oraculos podcast, there was a moment when it was really what I wanted it to be. And then that person quit. And now I'm back in a space where it's just me and I don't want to come up with content because I don't want to come out with content that looks less than the content that we were coming out with a couple months ago. So when it came to self-publishing or just publishing in general, I was confronted with two giants within the astrology publishing realm, and both of them wanted to publish Mastering Traditional Astrology for me. But when I really understood what that would entail, one of them, the contract that I was given, says that your book, basically your copyright for your book will belong to my company in every universe, in every parallel reality until the end of time. And I was like, girl, like, what's going on with you? And it literally said that. It literally said in every timeline, in every universe, in every parallel, whatever. And in perpetuity, basically, forever. And so that was very uncomfortable to me because I wanted to own my own material. I knew that I was the most talented part of the entire Oraculos thing. There would be no Oraculos if it wasn't me. And I didn't want to sell that to someone. I didn't want to give that to someone. I didn't want to sign that away to someone. So I said no to that. And then this other person, very famous publisher of two astrological books, not necessarily many astrological books, but two astrology books that are very, very, very famous, like groundbreakingly famous. This publishing house published those. And this person wanted to publish my work as well. But it was the same thing. And it was me not being able to like be nitty gritty and look at the quality and look at the details. And I told him no as well. And I don't know, it was a very harrowing thing. Publishing, mastering traditional astrology was very stressful. I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about InDesign, which is the Adobe software that you use to lay out a book so that it actually looks like a book. I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know anything about copywriting. I didn't know anything about getting the book into the Library of Congress. I didn't know anything about ISBNs. I didn't know anything about indexing and how an index should be done, which is why the first index in the first book is kind of unwieldy. But now I've sent it off to a group of indexers who have remade the index for MTA. And so that's why we have the index we have today. But I didn't know anything about any of these things. And it was very stressful and a lot about all of these things. And so the second book is a lot more it's just a better experience all around. And I'm so grateful that I went through it the first time and that I chose to do it by myself the first time, because the second book, it feels good. I think one of the challenges with publishing your own work is that you always think it's going to be ready before it's actually ready. Like in in MTA, I thought that MTA was going to be done by January. I actually thought it was going to be done by this. I actually thought it was going to be done by November. Then I thought it was going to be done by December. Then I thought it was going to be done by January, then February, then March, then April. And MTA didn't end up getting published until May 16th of 2023. And so that entire thing taught me the lesson of not hyping it up, because books are very fickle creatures and they're not done until they're done. And the sad reality is that you will never know when they're done until you know when they're done. And so with this next book, I haven't said a word to anyone about it. So I kind of feel like Beyonce, because I feel like I'm dropping this whole new album on the world and nobody even knows I'm publishing it. Nobody has any idea that this book is coming out. I'm going to let people know in a couple of weeks, after some things shift in the sky, but nobody knows that I'm publishing a book, and it is an extraordinary book. It's a groundbreaking book. The foreword that was written by Anthony Lewis, who also wrote a groundbreaking book on horary astrology. It is proof and testament to me that this book is beyond belief as far as horary astrology is concerned. It's going to be a huge game changer. I've done things in this book on horary astrology that no one has done at any point in astrological history over the course of probably 4,000 years. It's an amazing book and nobody knows that it's coming out. And so I also feel good about that, because writing a book, once again, is a very humbling process. You don't know that it's done until it's done. And I want to make sure that that book is absolutely done before I say anything to anyone. At the moment, it's absolutely done. The book could be published tomorrow and it would be completely fine. But I think in comparison to where I was a year ago, I'm in a much more silent place in terms of my writing process. And I think that's just how I'm going to crank out books for the rest of my life. Just hold it in silence and just know that, hey, another book is coming, another book is on its way. I'm already working on the third book. I'm sitting down during the research at the moment for the third book right now as we speak. And I love it. So I want to help astrologers publish their own books. I probably want to teach a class on it or something, so that people know the resources they need. They know the design team they need to hire. They know exactly the font that makes the most sense if you're publishing a book of a particular size. Know how best to lay out their diagrams. Know what should be in a diagram. What makes a diagram good versus what makes a diagram a poor diagram. I want to help astrologers who want to self-publish their work. I don't know if they're going to do it through Oraculos. I mean, that could be nice if Oraculos publishes the books of astrologers who I like or whose work I believe in. But I also just want to give the astrological community this knowledge so that they don't feel like they have to sell their copyright to somebody else and essentially end up getting 25 cents on a book that is being sold for $35. So that's kind of my goal. And I think that's the difference between where I was a year ago versus where I am now with this new book.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that exclusive information with us. It's been kept very close to the vest, and here I am blabbing it out. Luckily, my subscriber count is low right now. So it may stay in the community a little while longer. But just as we're closing out, one, I hope you don't let your shame tree hold you back for too long, because people on YouTube, we miss you. We love the content you share. And honestly, the people who are going to support you are going to do it regardless, even if it's not perfect in terms of how your setup is or your videos. So, do what you need to do. But my final questions as we're closing is, how are you integrating joy and ease into your life?
This is a wonderful question, and it's something that I set the intention of figuring out today. Like, I literally wrote a list of things to do, a list of things to do today. And one of the things to do was to figure out exactly that. Basically, how can I create more space for me within my life? And I am doing what I love. And I think that that's such a cliche thing when people say it, because am I really doing what I love? Like, I don't feel bubbling or oozing when I get up on a weekend and I teach astrology. Like, I don't feel butterflies in my stomach when I'm writing a book. It feels like work. It feels like labor. It feels like, oh my God, why do I have to go through this whole 575 pages to check and see if there are typos? Like, it feels exhausting. It is a job. It is a career. There's nothing romanticized about it. What I do is work. I work. I have a student population that is vast, and I worked to make that happen. It is labor.
Mm.
And at the same time, I would hate if I was doing that work for somebody else. I would hate if I was putting in those same hours working in a bank or working for a newspaper or working in an accounting firm or working in that sort of way. So I think that while I don't love what I do in a way that makes me feel like, oh my God, I'm in love, I do feel like I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I don't necessarily think that that should be joyful, because it's not joyful. I'm running a business. Like, I'm I'm running a business. It's work, but so it isn't joyful in the microcosm, but I think it's joyful in the macrocosm in terms of all of the things that I could be doing. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And therefore, I feel like staying up until 3 a.m. in the morning, reading that manuscript from the 13th century on geomancy, because this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I wouldn't feel that same way if I was clocking in for somebody else's 9 to 5. So there's that side of things. And within that, I also acknowledge that I need more space for rest within my life. And so at the moment, as it stands, every waking hour of time within my daily life is taken up with something. It's always something. And now I'm going to be writing this new book on geomancy, and the manuscripts for that are in French and Hebrew, which means even though I basically have a minor in French, I need to go and find a French tutor again, so that within the course of the next year, my French is up to par for me to be translating these manuscripts, because I want the geomancy book to come out in a year's time. But also I need to call back my Hebrew tutor to make sure that my Hebrew is up to par to be translating these geomancy manuscripts. So I'm already looking at 2 more hours out of each day being absorbed with a French class and a Hebrew class, so that I could be in a position to also translate the books that are going to be the basis for the next book that I write. And when I think about that, it seems so natural to me to do that, but the lived experience of it is stressful. So what I want to do, you asked, how am I cultivating joy within my life? I'm not sure I'm cultivating joy within my life. And I think that that's actually where I am right now, because I feel like all I'm cultivating in my life right now is work. But what I want to do is I want to find more hours of free time within my day. I want to find hours of nothing within my day. And I don't know where they're going to come from because I have a lot of things that I am doing. But I think that if I could really cultivate that for myself and really have time where I say, hey, I don't have anything to do, I'm just free as a bee, and that's okay. I think if I can do that, I'll be in a far more joyful and possibly more creative space in my life. That's what I want. I want space at this point.
Mm-hmm. Love that. I think that's a beautiful place to close. Is there anything else you'd like to share about what you've got going on before we dip out?
No, just if you want to stay in the loop with all the things we're doing, please make sure to check out oraculosastrology.com, where you could find out all about our summer programming. We have our 6th annual Horary Summer Intensive coming up, and that's going to be in June, starting June 8th, and that's going to be pretty amazing. It's going to be the first intensive that we actually have a textbook for, which means hopefully we can go deeper, swim further, and really do some pretty cool stuff. So please, if you want to study at Oraculos, you can join us this summer for our upcoming horror intensive.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for being here, Mychal, my sensei and my friends. I appreciate you. And thank you all for watching. Love you guys. Peace. Thank you so much for sticking through this video and watching to the end. I really appreciate you being here. If you would like to book readings with either of us or any type of session, reach out to us at our contact information. I'll put it in the description box below. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them in the comments. Also, subscribe to the channel, like it if you enjoyed the video, and feel free to share it with friends as well. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for being here. And be sure to look out for our next video where I'll be talking to Miss Stephanie Perry, who has blown up on YouTube, talking her talk about Black women leaving the US. So you won't want to miss this conversation. It's very inspiring, and Stephanie's just a great guest. So check us out. Very soon you'll see the video dropping. But if you want to know immediately when it's out, definitely click that notification bell so you can be ready and stay ready for when I come through with new videos. Thanks again for being here. Peace.